Wyoming Territory, 1883. Blood seeped through Eleanor Montgomery's fingers as she pressed her hand against her side, each labored breath sending fresh waves of pain through her body. 3 days on horseback, with a bullet lodged in her ribs, had left her delirious with fever. The September winds howled across the desolate plains, cutting through her tattered coat with merciless precision. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, her voice carried away by the wind. Just a little further. But to where? The town of Clearwater was at least 2 days' ride, and her horse had collapsed beneath her hours ago. The faithful animal now lay dead half a mile back, leaving Eleanor to stumble forward on foot through the growing darkness. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the Medicine Bow Mountains, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson. Eleanor found bitter irony in the beauty of what might be her final sunset. At 29, she'd seen enough ugliness to last several lifetimes. She thought of Jonathan, her husband, his face now fading in her memory after 3 years. Had it really been that long since the mine collapse? Since she'd been forced to make her way alone in a world that showed little kindness to a woman without protection? Eleanor's boot caught on a rock, sending her sprawling face first into the dirt. The impact forced a scream from her lungs, the pain in her side flaring white-hot. She tasted blood and earth, the metallic tongue mixing with the dust of Wyoming Territory. "Get up," she commanded herself, though her limbs refused to comply. "Get up, or you die right here." With tremendous effort, Eleanor rolled onto her back, staring up at the first stars emerging in the twilight sky. The fever made them dance and swirl in patterns. That reminded her of the lace on her mother's wedding dress, one of the few clear memories she had of the woman who died bringing her into the world. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Ellie, girl, there ain't no use in quitting while you still got breath." But her breath was coming shorter now, each inhalation a battle against her failing body. The blood had soaked through her shirt and vest, sticky and warm against her skin, despite the growing chill of the night. How had it come to this? Running for her life across the territory, a bullet in her side courtesy of Gilbert Vaughn's hired gun. She should have known better than to refuse the businessman's generous offer. No one said no to Vaughn, especially not a widow working as a saloon pianist in a town he practically owned. Eleanor closed her eyes, the stars too bright, too mocking in their distant beauty. The pain began to recede, replaced by a spreading numbness that terrified her more than the agony had. This was death approaching, she realized, not with the violent struggle she'd always imagined, but with a quiet, seductive promise of rest. Sound penetrated her fading consciousness, the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats. Eleanor forced her eyes open, straining to see through the gathering darkness. A lone rider approached, silhouetted against the deepening purple of the evening sky. "Help." She tried to call, but produced only a broken whisper. "Please ... The rider drew closer, then stopped. Eleanor heard the creak of leather as the figure dismounted. Heavy footsteps approached, and then a man's face appeared above her, weathered and tanned beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. With eyes that seemed to hold their own kind of darkness, Eleanor attempted to speak again, managing wholly. They single quotes coming ... The stranger knelt beside her, examining her wound with calloused hands that moved with surprising gentleness. His face remained impassive, offering neither comfort nor threat. He made no reply to her warning. "Can single quotes speak?" Eleanor whispered, her consciousness slipping. The man simply shook his head once, then slid his arms beneath her broken body. The movement sent fresh agony coursing through her, and Eleanor's world finally dissolved into blessed darkness. Consciousness returned in fragments, the crackling of a fire, the scent of pine smoke, the rough texture of a woolen blanket against her skin. Pain, duller now, but still present. throbbing in her side with each heartbeat. Eleanor opened her eyes to find herself in a small cabin, lying on a narrow bed. The walls were built of rough-hewn logs, the ceiling low and crossed with wooden beams. A fire burned in a stone hearth across the single room, casting dancing shadows over simple furnishings. A table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies. Attempted to sit up, a mistake that sent sharp pain lancing through her side. A groan escaped her lips before she could suppress it. Movement caught her attention. The stranger from the plains rose from a chair by the fire and approached. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with premature gray at the temples. His beard was neatly trimmed, revealing a strong jaw and a thin scar that ran from his right ear to the corner of his mouth. He wore simple clothing, a cotton shirt, dark trousers, suspenders, the practical attire of a working man. He carried a tin cup of water, which he offered to Eleanor. When she tried to take it, her hands trembled too violently to hold it. Steady. Without hesitation, he sat on the edge of the bed and supported her head, helping her drink. "Thank you," Eleanor said when she'd finished. Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, rough from disuse. "How long have I been here?" The man held up 3 fingers. 3 days? Eleanor asked, receiving a nod in confirmation. "You can't speak." "At all?" The man shook his head, then touched his throat and made a slicing motion with his hand. "By choice, not injury," Eleanor interpreted, and he nodded again. She tried to process this information through the fog still clouding her mind. "My name is Eleanor Montgomery. Most call me Ellie." The stranger rose and retrieved a small slate and chalk from a shelf. He wrote quickly, then turned it to face her. "Nathaniel Hayes. Nate, you're safe here." "Where is here?" Eleanor asked. "My ranch, 30 miles from Clearwater." "You saved my life, Mr. Hayes." He shrugged, as if plucking dying women from the wilderness was a common occurrence, then wrote again. "Who shot you?" Eleanor hesitated, the memory of her flight from Silver Peak causing her heart to race. Men who work for Gilbert Vaughn. "He's a businessman in Silver Peak." "Why?" "I refused an arrangement he proposed. He doesn't take rejection well." Eleanor kept her explanation deliberately vague. The less the stranger knew, the safer he would be if Vaughn's men tracked her here. Studied her face, his expression suggesting he recognized her omissions, but wouldn't press further. He wrote again. "Doctor coming tomorrow. Rest." "Doctor?" "No," Eleanor said, panic rising in her voice. "No one can know I'm here." "Please." Nate's brow furrowed, and he wrote quickly. "Bullet out, but wound infected. Need medicine. Promise me you won't tell anyone my name. Please." Eleanor reached out and caught his wrist, her fingers barely encircling it. "Promise me." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. He wrote on the slate again. "You're my cousin from Denver. Sarah." Relief washed over Eleanor. "Thank you." Nate nodded again, and gently pressed her shoulder, encouraging her to lie back. Eleanor realized how exhausted she felt from just this brief conversation. As she settled against the pillow, she noticed a rifle propped by the door and a revolver on the table, both clean and well-maintained. "Are you expecting trouble, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her eyelids growing heavy. He shook his head and wrote one last message, just prepared for it. Sleep now. As Eleanor drifted back into unconsciousness, her last thought was that she had placed her life in the hands of a man who communicated in chalk dust and silence, and somehow it felt safer than anywhere she'd been in years. The doctor arrived shortly after noon the next day. Eleanor awoke to hushed movements and the creak of the cabin door. Panic surged through her until she saw Nate's reassuring nod from across the room. The physician was an elderly man with spectacles perched. precariously on his nose and hands that belied his age with their steadiness. "So this is the cousin from Denver," he said, setting his bag beside the bed. "Nathaniel here says you took a fall from your horse and caught yourself on some fencing. Nasty business." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "Yes, quite clumsy of me." "They—" Doctor's eyes narrowed slightly as he examined her wound, his expression revealing that he recognized a bullet hole when he saw one. Yet he asked no questions, simply cleaned and redressed the injury with practiced efficiency. "You're lucky," he said finally. "The infection's responding to whatever poultice Nate's been using. Another day without treatment, and we'd be having a very different conversation." He pressed a small glass bottle of pills into her hand. "Quinine for the fever. Take as directed." Before leaving, the doctor pulled Nate aside. Eleanor strained to hear their conversation, catching only fragments. Double quotes ... "Not my business ... and ... careful, Nathaniel ... After the doctor departed, Nate returned to Eleanor's bedside, his expression unreadable. She studied him openly now, noting the way his movements spoke volumes and the absence of his voice economical, yet graceful, like a man accustomed to hard work and solitude. "He knows I wasn't injured by fencing," Eleanor said. Nate nodded, then wrote on his slate, "Won't tell. How can you be sure? Doc Simmons keeps secrets." Like me, Eleanor sank back against her pillow. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." "I could be a criminal." A hint of amusement flickered in Nate's eyes as he wrote, "Are you?" "No," she answered honestly. "But I've done things I'm not proud of to survive." "Haven't we all?" The statement hung between them, neither question nor judgment. For the first time since Jonathan's death, Eleanor felt understood without having to explain herself. "Why don't you speak?" she asked finally, immediately regretting her boldness when Nate's expression closed off. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the landscape beyond. For several minutes he remained motionless, shoulders rigid with tension. Eleanor was about to apologize when he returned, slate in hand. War. Sharpsburg. 1862. Eleanor knew enough history to recognize the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. "You fought?" He nodded, then wrote more. "Screamed orders all day. Men died anyway." Last words I spoke. The simple statement conveyed more horror than pages of detailed description could have. Eleanor reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing his wrist. "I'm sorry." Nate's expression softened slightly, and he added, "Choice, not injury." "A vow of silence," Eleanor murmured, understanding dawning. "For 13 years?" He nodded, then wrote, "Enough talk. Rest now." The days passed with surprising swiftness. As Eleanor's strength returned, she began to notice more details about her sanctuary, the careful craftsmanship of the cabin's furniture, the small collection of books on a shelf, poetry among them. Surprisingly, the orderly way Nate arranged his few possessions. By the end of her second week at the ranch, she could sit up for longer periods and even make short, careful walks around the cabin. Nate proved an attentive but unobtrusive caretaker, somehow anticipating her needs before she voiced them. They developed an easy rhythm of communication. Nate used his slate when necessary, but increasingly relied on gestures and expressions that Eleanor found herself able to read with growing accuracy. For her part, she filled the silence with occasional stories from her childhood in Ohio, careful to avoid any mention of recent years or Silver Peak. One evening, as they shared a simple meal of venison stew, Eleanor worked up the courage to ask, "About the ranch. Do you manage this place alone?" Nate nodded, then wrote, 160 acres. Small herd. Enough. No family? She asked, then immediately regretted the question when his face darkened. After a long pause, he wrote, Had a wife, Sarah. Fever. Took her and our son. 1874. The name struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Sarah, that's why you chose that name for me with the doctor. He nodded once, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, she said softly. I've intruded on your solitude and your memories. Nate shook his head firmly, writing. Company not unwelcome. The admission, simple as it was, seemed to cost him something. He rose and busied himself with the fire, his back to her for several minutes. When he returned to the table, his composure was restored. He wrote, Your husband? Jonathan, Eleanor replied, her fingers tracing patterns in the wooden tabletop. We came west for the silver boom. He worked the mines in Silver Peak while I played piano at the hotel. The shaft collapsed 3 years ago. 27 men died. She didn't mention how Vaughn's company had ignored safety concerns raised by the miners for months before the disaster, or how the widows had received pittances as compensation while the mine reopened within weeks. Those were dangerous truths. Play? Nate wrote, gesturing toward an upright piano tucked in the corner that Eleanor had assumed was merely furniture. Yes, it was Sarah's. She guessed Dottie nodded, a wistful expression crossing his face. I haven't played in months, Eleanor said, suddenly yearning for the familiar comfort of keys beneath her fingers. May I? Nate helped her to the bench, his strong hand steady at her elbow. The piano was badly in need of tuning, but when Eleanor began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the gentle melody filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She lost herself in the music, eyes closed, fingers remembering what her mind had temporarily forgotten beauty, existed alongside pain. When she finished, the silence felt different somehow, charged with emotion. Eleanor opened her eyes to find Nate watching her, his customary stoicism replaced by naked wonder. For a breathless moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps of kindred damaged souls. Then he blinked, and the moment passed. He nodded once in appreciation and helped her back to bed, his touch carefully impersonal. That night, Eleanor dreamed not of pursuit or danger, but of open skies and possibilities. Following morning brought unwelcome reality in the form of 3 riders approaching the ranch. Nate spotted them first from the window, his entire body tensing as he reached for his rifle. Eleanor's heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Is it them? Vaughn's men? Nate shook his head, writing quickly. Neighbors. Jenkins' brothers. He positioned himself at the door, rifle held casually but ready as the riders approached. Eleanor remained inside, peering through a window as 3 men dismounted in the yard. Hayes, called the eldest, a burly man with a shock of white hair. Been a while since we've seen you in town. Nate nodded in acknowledgement, but made no move. To invite them closer. Spotted smoke from your chimney all week, continued the man. Not like you in summer. Everything all right? Nate nodded again. The youngest of the 3, barely out of boyhood, shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Hayes, there's talk in town. Some men asking questions about a woman. Dark hair, traveling alone, offering good money for information. Eleanor's blood ran cold. They'd traced her this far already. Thought you should know, added the middle brother. They don't look like the law, more like trouble. Nate wrote something on a paper and handed it to the eldest Jenkins. The man read it, nodded, and pocketed the note. We'll do that, he said. And we never saw anyone here but you, understood? Nate extended his hand, which the elder Jenkins shook firmly before the brothers mounted up and rode away. When they were gone, Eleanor sank onto a chair, trembling. They're coming. I have to leave. I've put you in danger long enough. Nate shook his head vehemently, writing, Not yet. Still weak. I can't let you risk yourself for me, she insisted. These men, They don't leave witnesses. Why do they want you? Eleanor hesitated, then decided Nate deserved the truth. I worked for Vaughn as a bookkeeper as well as a pianist. I discovered he was defrauding investors and stealing from the miners' widow's fund, including what should have come to me after Jonathan died. When I confronted him, he offered me a choice: become his mistress and keep quiet, or disappear permanently. She laughed bitterly. I chose a third option. I took his ledgers, the ones that prove his crimes, and ran. He wants them back almost as much as he wants me dead. Where are they? Hidden in Silver Peak. Eleanor met his gaze directly. I need to recover them. It's the only leverage I have. Nate considered this, then wrote simply, "We will? We?" Eleanor shook her head. "This isn't your fight. Made it mine when I found you." The simple declaration left no room for argument. Nate wrote again. Plan first. Heal more. Then go. How long do we have? Jenkins will send them east. Buy time. Understanding dawned. Your note you sent them on a false trail? Nate nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. Why risk yourself for me? Eleanor asked softly. You barely know me. He studied her for a long moment before writing. Know enough. The words, stark in their simplicity, carried a weight that settled in Eleanor's chest. Not the crushing pressure of fear she'd carried for months, but something warmer, more dangerous. In its own way, ... as October painted the surrounding hills in amber and crimson, Eleanor's strength returned in earnest. Her wound healed to a puckered scar, tender but no longer debilitating. With recovery came restlessness and a growing awareness that she couldn't hide forever on Nate's isolated ranch. She began contributing to the daily work simple tasks at first, then more complex ones as her body allowed. She cooked meals, mended clothing, and eventually helped with the livestock. The routine provided a comforting structure that had been absent from her life since Jonathan's death. Nate proved to be a patient teacher, showing rather than telling how to perform each task. His methods were efficient, his expectations clear without being demanding. Eleanor found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way his hands moved with surprising delicacy for their size, how his eyes revealed thoughts his voice never expressed. One afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing a section of fence, Eleanor broached the subject they'd been avoiding. We need to discuss Silver Peak, she said, driving a nail with more force than necessary. The ledgers won't stay hidden forever, and Vaughn won't stop searching. Nate nodded, producing his slate. 2 days' ride. Need plan. I've been thinking about that, Eleanor replied. I can't simply walk into town. I'd be recognized immediately. Disguise? Possibly. But the real challenge is retrieving the ledgers. I hid them beneath the floorboards of the old schoolhouse on the edge of town. It's abandoned now, but Vaughn's men might be watching it. Draw them away? That could work, Eleanor said thoughtfully. Create a distraction elsewhere in town. They spent the remainder of the afternoon developing a strategy, Eleanor speaking and Nate responding with written notes or nods. By sunset, they had the outline of a workable plan. They would travel to Silver Peak as father and son, with Eleanor disguised in men's clothing and her hair hidden beneath a hat. Nate would create a distraction at Vaughn's office, while Eleanor retrieved the ledgers. Then they would slip out of town separately and reunite at a predetermined location. As they walked back to the cabin in the gathering dusk, Eleanor realized with surprise that she felt more alive than she had in years. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, she had purpose again. We should leave in 3 days, she suggested as they reached the porch. That gives us time to prepare and allows for the new moon. We'll have darkness on our side. Nate nodded in agreement, then paused, his expression troubled. He wrote, dangerous. Could stay here. And wait for them to find me? No, Eleanor shook her head firmly. I'm tired of running. Those ledgers are my only chance at justice, not just for me, but for all the widows Vaughn cheated. Could die. We all die eventually, Mr. Hayes, Eleanor said softly. The question is whether we've stood for something that matters first. Something shifted in Nate's gaze, respect, perhaps, or recognition. He nodded once, decisively, and wrote, "Together, then." The word lingered between them, carrying implications neither was ready to examine closely. That evening, as rain pattered against the roof and wind whistled through the eaves, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The prospect of returning to Silver Peak filled her with both dread and determination. She rose from her bed, no longer Nate's, as he had insisted on using a bedroll by the fire despite her protests, and moved to the window. Lightning flashed across the sky, briefly illuminating the landscape beyond the glass. In that instant, Eleanor caught sight of movement at the edge of the property. A figure on horseback, barely visible through the downpour. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Nate," she called softly, turning to find him already awake, rifle in hand. He had seen it too. He motioned for her to stay back from the window, then moved silently to the door, checking that it was securely bolted. He extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. They waited in tense silence, listening for any sound above the storm. Minutes stretched endlessly until another lightning strike revealed not one rider, but three, closer now, approaching the cabin with deliberate slowness. "Vaughn's men," Eleanor whispered. "They found me." Nate shook his head and gestured toward the back of the cabin. In the darkness, he guided her to a concealed trapdoor beneath the rug-a-root cellar. Eleanor realized as he lifted the heavy wooden panel. He pressed his slate into her hands. When lightning flashed again, she read his hasty message. "Stay hidden, no matter what." "I won't leave you to face them alone," she protested. His hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing once, firmly. The gesture conveyed more than words could have. "Trust me," it said. "I know what I'm doing." Eleanor reluctantly descended the ladder into the cellar. Nate closed the trapdoor above her, sliding something heavy across it, the rug and table. She guessed, concealing its existence. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of earth and preserved vegetables. Eleanor found a position where she could press her ear against the wooden ceiling, straining to hear what transpired above. Heavy knocking echoed through the cabin. Footsteps crossed the floor. Nate answering the door. Male voices, unfamiliar and threatening. "Evening, mister. Sorry to trouble you so late." The voice was smooth, educated, not what Eleanor had expected from one of Vaughn's hired guns. "We're looking for a woman. Dark-haired, pretty. Might be injured. Name of Eleanor Montgomery." Silence, Nate's trademark response. "Cat got your tongue, friend?" A different voice, harsher. More silence, then the sound of paper scratching. Nate writing on his slate. "Can't speak, huh?" said the first voice. "Convenient. Mind if we look around?" Footsteps moved throughout the cabin. Eleanor held her breath, pressing herself into the darkest corner of the cellar. "Nice place," commented the first voice. "Awful isolated, though. Must get lonely." The sound of items being moved, searched, discarded. Glass breaking one of Nate's few photographs. Eleanor guessed with a pang of guilt. "Nothing here, Burke," said the third man, previously silent. "You sure about that?" replied the one called Burke. Jenkins over at the Mercantile said he hadn't seen anyone matching her description. Seemed mighty certain about it. Too certain, if you ask me. More silence. "Not much for conversation, are you?" Burke's tone hardened. "Let me be clear, friend. Gilbert Vaughn pays us well to find people who've crossed him. That woman stole something valuable from him. Anyone harboring her is making a powerful enemy. Eleanor heard what sounded like a chair scraping across the floor, then the distinctive click of a revolver being cocked. "Last chance," said Burke. "Where is Eleanor Montgomery?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch eternally. Then, to Eleanor's shock, she heard something she never expected: Nate's voice. Rusty from disuse, but clear and steady. Double quotes. Not ... here. The words sounded painfully forced, as though dragged from the depths of his being. Saw a woman. 3 days ago. Heading ... north. To Montana. The shock of hearing Nate speak momentarily distracted Eleanor from the content of his words. He had broken his 13-year silence for her. "See, that wasn't so hard," Burke said, his tone mockingly friendly. "North to Montana, you say? Territorial." "Road," Nate managed, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. A long pause followed, then Burke spoke again. "If I find out you're lying, I'll be back, and I won't be nearly so polite. Understand?" Nate replied, his voice slightly stronger. Footsteps moved toward the door. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Hayes." "Mr. Hayes, good night." The door opened and closed. Eleanor remained frozen in place, listening as horses' hooves receded into the distance. Still, she didn't move, remembering Nate's instruction to stay hidden no matter what. Several minutes passed before the trapdoor opened, lamplight spilling into the cellar. Nate stood above her, his face grim but resolute. He extended a hand to help her climb out. Eleanor emerged from the cellar on shaky legs. "You spoke," she said, staring at him in wonder. "You broke your vow." Nate nodded, retrieving his slate to write. "Necessary." "Why?" she asked. After 13 years of silence, why now? He considered for a long moment before writing. Some things worth speaking for. The simple statement hung in the air between them, its implications too vast to examine in the aftermath of danger. Instead, Eleanor focused on practicalities. "They'll realize you lied when they find no trace of me on the northern road. Buys time. Need to move faster now. We leave tomorrow?" Eleanor suggested. Nate nodded, then wrote, "Tonight. Pack only essentials." As they gathered supplies in urgent silence, Eleanor found herself watching Nate more closely than before. The breaking of his vow represented something profound, a choice to reconnect, however briefly, with the world he had shut out for so long. That he had done so for her safety stirred emotions she had thought long buried. Within an hour, they had packed provisions, ammunition, and minimal personal belongings onto 2 horses. The storm had passed, leaving a sky brilliant with stars, and a half-moon that provided just enough light to travel by. As they prepared to depart, Eleanor placed a hand on Nate's arm. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." He nodded once, then surprised her by speaking again, his voice stronger than before, but still rough from years of silence. "Worth it." 2 words, yet they conveyed volumes. Eleanor felt something shift between them in that moment, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. But there was no time to explore it further. Vaughn's men had found the ranch, which meant they were closing in. They rode out under cover of darkness, leaving behind the sanctuary that had briefly been theirs, heading toward a confrontation both knew could not be avoided much longer. The journey to Silver Peak took longer than anticipated. They traveled by night and concealed themselves during daylight hours, taking circuitous routes to avoid main trails where Vaughn's men might be watching. By the time they reached the outskirts of the mining town, 4 days had passed since there. Hasty departure from the ranch. Eleanor barely recognized Silver Peak as they observed it from a ridge overlooking the valley. In the 3 months since her flight, new buildings had sprung up, evidence of the prosperity Gilbert Vaughn flaunted while miners' families struggled. The sight of the town, once her home, now hostile territory, filled her with conflicting emotions. "The schoolhouse is there," she whispered, pointing to an abandoned building at the eastern edge of town. "The ledgers are beneath the floorboards, under the teacher's desk." Nate nodded, studying the layout of the streets through a spyglass. He had spoken little since that night at the ranch, reverting mostly to his slate for communication, though. Occasionally, he would offer single words when writing proved impractical. Each spoken word seemed carefully chosen, as if he were rationing them after years of hoarding silence. They established camp in a secluded hollow 2 miles from town, finalizing their plan as dusk approached. Eleanor changed into men's clothing. They had brought trousers, shirt, vest, and coat, all Nate's and too large for her frame, but serviceable when belted and rolled appropriately. She tucked her hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat, smudged dirt strategically on her face, and practiced walking with the masculine gait she'd observed in saloons for years. Nate watched her transformation with a mixture of admiration and concern. When she finished, he wrote, "Convincing, but dangerous still." "Life is dangerous, Mr. Hayes," Eleanor replied with a wry smile. "Especially mine." As final darkness fell, they mounted their horses and approached town from different directions, as planned. Eleanor entered from the east, keeping her head down, and shoulders hunched to disguise her height and build. Nate would create his distraction at precisely 9 o'clock, giving her 15 minutes to retrieve the ledgers and escape before they reunited at their predetermined meeting point north of town. Silver Peak's main street was busy despite the late hour, the saloons and gambling halls doing brisk business. Eleanor kept to the shadows, heart pounding painfully against her ribs as she passed men who would have recognized her in her usual attire. Her disguise held no one gave the slight dirty young man more than a passing glance. She reached the abandoned schoolhouse without incident. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, the windows boarded over long ago. Eleanor slipped inside, allowing her eyes to adjust to the deeper darkness. The building smelled of dust and rotting wood, its abandonment complete. The teacher's desk remained where she had left it, a hulking shadow against the far wall. Eleanor moved toward it, stepping carefully on floorboards that creaked with each movement. Reaching the desk, she knelt and felt beneath it for the loose board she had pried up months ago. Her fingers found the edge, and she carefully lifted the plank. Relief flooded her as she reached into the cavity and touched oilskin her package. Undisturbed, she withdrew the wrapped ledgers, securing them inside her coat. A distant commotion reached her ears, shouting and the sound of breaking glass. Nate's distraction had begun right on schedule. Eleanor smiled grimly and made her way back to the schoolhouse door. She was reaching for the handle when it pushed open from the outside. "Well, well," said a familiar voice. "What have we here?" Gilbert. Vaughn stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men including Burke, whom Eleanor recognized from his voice. Vaughn was exactly as she remembered, immaculately dressed, silver-haired, his refined appearance belying his ruthless nature. "Miss Montgomery," he said, smiling coldly. "Or should I say, Mr. Montgomery?" An impressive disguise, but ultimately futile. Eleanor's hand moved toward the revolver concealed in her coat, but Burke was faster, his weapon already trained on her. "I wouldn't," he advised. "How did you know?" Eleanor asked, mind racing for an escape route. Vaughn chuckled. "You're silent. Friend Mr. Hayes isn't as clever as he thinks. When my men reported his suspicious behavior, I had them followed rather than confronted. You led us straight to what I want." He extended his hand. "The ledgers, please, so you can destroy them?" Eleanor backed away slowly. "They're my insurance." "They're evidence of nothing except your theft," Vaughn replied smoothly. "Who would? Believe a saloon pianist over a respected businessman? The word of a widow desperate for money?" The territorial marshal might be interested in reviewing your creative accounting, Eleanor countered, especially regarding those government contracts. Vaughn's smile faltered slightly. The ledgers, he repeated, his tone hardening. Now. A commotion outside drew their attention, more shouting. Closer now. Burke glanced nervously over his shoulder. Boss, if fire's spreading faster than planned, we need to go. Fire? Eleanor's blood ran cold. What have you done? Your friends? Distraction provided inspiration, Vaughn said with a shrug. The livery stable is quite flammable this time of year. Unfortunate, but effective at clearing the streets while we conclude our business. Horror washed over Eleanor as she realized the implications. Nate would have gone to the livery first to secure horses for their escape. If the stable was burning, Vaughn must have read her expression. Yes, I expect Mr. Hayes is rather occupied. At the moment, if he's still alive. The ledgers, Miss Montgomery. Final chance. Eleanor's mind worked frantically. She needed to get to Nate to verify he was safe. But surrendering the ledgers meant losing her only leverage against Vaughn. The decision was made for her when a thunderous crash sounded from outside, followed by screams. Burke turned toward the noise, momentarily distracted. Eleanor seized the opportunity, drawing her revolver and firing in one fluid motion. The bullet struck Burke in the shoulder, spinning him backwards. His own weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling. Eleanor lunged for the door, shoving past Vaughn and his other man. Emerging into chaos, half the town seemed ablaze, the fire spreading from building to building with terrifying speed. Townspeople ran in all directions, some carrying buckets, others simply fleeing. Through the smoke and confusion, Eleanor oriented herself toward the livery stable, now fully engulfed in flames. Nate, she called, running toward the inferno, the ledgers clutched tightly against her side. Nate! A hand grabbed her arm from behind. Eleanor whirled, ready to fight, only to find Nate himself, soot-streaked but alive, his eyes wild with urgency. Eleanor, he said, his voice stronger than she had yet heard it. This way. He pulled her down an alley between buildings. As gunshots rang out behind them, Vaughn's men in pursuit. They emerged onto a side street where two horses waited, reins tied hastily to a hitching post. You're alive, Eleanor gasped as they mounted. The stable. Later, Nate replied, spurring his horse forward. Ride. They galloped through the burning town, weaving between panicked citizens and fallen debris. Behind them, more gunshots sounded, bullets whining past their heads. Eleanor hunched low over her horse's neck, the precious ledgers secure inside her. Coat. They had nearly reached the edge of town when Eleanor heard Nate cry out. She turned to see him slumping in his saddle, one hand pressed to his side. Even in the flickering light of the fires, she could see dark liquid seeping between his fingers. Nate, she cried, pulling alongside him. You're hit. Keep going. He managed, straightening with visible effort. Almost clear. They pushed onward, leaving the burning town behind, riding hard for nearly an hour before Nate's strength began to fail. His horse slowed despite his urging, and Eleanor watched in horror as he slid sideways in the saddle. She caught him before he could fall, somehow managing to bring both horses to a stop in a small grove of trees. With tremendous effort, she helped Nate to the ground, propping him against a trunk. Let me see, she demanded, pulling his hand away from the wound. Blood soaked his shirt and vest, glistening black in the moonlight. The bullet had caught him in the lower ribs, the entry wound small but ominously deep. Bad? He asked. His voice strained. Eleanor tried to keep her expression neutral, but fear must have shown in her eyes. I've seen worse, she lied. Nate's mouth quirked in a ghost of a smile. Poor liar. Eleanor tore strips from her shirt to create a makeshift bandage, packing the wound as best she could. "We need to get you to a doctor. No towns nearby." Nate's breathing grew more labored. Vaughn's men still looking. "The ranch, then," Eleanor decided. "Can you ride if I help you?" Nate nodded weakly. With tremendous effort, Eleanor got him back on his horse, mounting behind him to support his weight. They traveled slowly through the night, Nate drifting in and out of consciousness against her shoulder, Eleanor leading both horses at a careful pace. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached the ranch. Eleanor had never been so grateful to see the small cabin, its solitary presence on the landscape, representing safety and home in a way she had never anticipated. Getting Nate inside proved challenging. He was barely conscious, his tall frame heavy against her as she half dragged him to the bed. The bullet remained lodged inside him, and Eleanor knew with growing dread that removing it exceeded her limited medical skills. "Hold on," she urged, as she cleaned the wound with whiskey, causing Nate to jerk in pain despite his semi-conscious state. "Just hold on, Nathaniel." For 3 days, Eleanor maintained her vigil beside Nate's bed. The fever came, as she had feared it would, sending him into bouts of delirium where he called out names she didn't recognize, comrades from the war. She guessed, and occasionally Sarah. During his lucid moments, she spooned broth into his mouth and bathed his burning skin with cool cloths. On the 4th morning, Eleanor woke from a brief, exhausted sleep to find Nate watching her, his eyes clear for the first time since their escape. "You're still here," he said, his voice weak but steady. Eleanor moved quickly to his side, pressing a hand to his forehead. The fever had broken. "Where else would I be?" she asked softly. "Thought you'd take the ledgers, start over somewhere." "Without you?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not a chance, Mr. Hayes." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Nathaniel," he corrected. "After all, this should use my name." "Nathaniel," she agreed, taking his hand in hers. "I'd never leave you behind." He studied her face for a long moment. "Why?" the question hung between them, simple yet profound. Eleanor considered deflecting with humor or practicality, but in the end, the truth seemed the only appropriate response. "Because you're the first person since Jonathan died who made me feel like I wasn't alone," she said quietly. "Because you risked everything to help a stranger. Because you spoke, after 13 years of silence, to protect me." She squeezed his hand gently. "Because somewhere along the way, you became important to me." Nate's eyes held hers, emotions flickering across his face, wonder, hesitation, and something deeper she dared not name yet. "Not good with words," he said finally. Eleanor smiled. "I've noticed, but I want to find them again." He took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain it caused. "With you, if you'll stay?" The question beneath the statement was clear. Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unexpected gift of possibility after so much loss. "I'll stay," she promised. "We'll face whatever comes together." The confrontation with Vaughn came 2 weeks later, not in violence, but in justice. Eleanor had sent the ledgers to the territorial marshal with a detailed letter explaining their significance. The evidence proved irrefutable. Gilbert Vaughn was arrested on multiple charges of fraud, embezzlement, and, most satisfyingly, theft from the miners' widows' fund. News reached them via Doc Simmons, who came to check on Nate's recovery and brought a newspaper detailing Vaughn's downfall. The doctor also brought word that Silver Peak was rebuilding after the fire, which had claimed no lives but had destroyed nearly a third of the town. The new mayor's promising better conditions for the miners, the doctor reported as he examined Nate's healing wound. Apparently, quite a few of Vaughn's secrets came to light once people started talking. Justice has a way of finding its path, Eleanor remarked, exchanging a meaningful glance with Nate. After the doctor left, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. Nate's arm rested comfortably around Eleanor's shoulders, a gesture that had become natural in recent days. "What now?" he asked, his voice growing stronger with daily use, though he still spoke sparingly, choosing his words with care. Eleanor leaned against him, savoring his warmth and solidity. "Now we begin," she said simply. "Together." Nate nodded, understanding all she left unspoken. Their pasts, with all their trauma and silence, would always be part of them. But they had found in each other something neither had expected to discover again. A future worth speaking for, worth fighting for. As darkness settled over the land, Nate Hayes spoke the words he had held inside for 13 years, offering them now as both gift and promise to the woman who had brought him back from the edge of his self-imposed exile. "I love you, Eleanor." 4 words, simple, unadorned, powerful in their honesty. Eleanor turned in his embrace, cupping his face between her palms, her eyes reflecting the first emerging stars. "And I love you, Nathaniel Hayes," she replied, "more than I have words for." In the silence that followed, not the empty silence of loss and isolation, but the rich, peaceful silence of understanding, they watched night claim the land that had become their home, secure in the knowledge that whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them as they had survived the past, together.